Can a society, riddled with flaws, truly achieve greatness? In CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 04, Episode 17, we crack open Will Durant's Fallen Leaves to explore a philosopher's changing mind on the very essence of American democracy. Welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're embarking on, well, a truly fascinating journey, I think. We're going into the late life reflections of a real giant of philosophy, Will Durant. We'll be digging into how he grappled with the complex, often contradictory evolution of American democracy. Our main source here is his really profound final work, Fallen Leaves.
Yeah, a culmination of so much thought.
Exactly. And this isn't just like a dry history lesson about politics or policy, not at all. It's more about watching a deep thinker, someone who spent his whole life trying to understand human civilization, its big experiments,
Right.
how he comes to terms with the messy realities of progress, the stickiness of human nature, and those ideals a nation aims for, even if it falls short.
It's really a masterclass in intellectual honesty, isn't it? Watching someone grow and reassess.
Totally. Humility and growth, seeing that even the sharpest minds can have these big shifts in how they see things.
And that idea, that reevaluation, that's exactly what we want to focus on in this deep dive. Our goal is to understand how Durant, looking back over decades of really rigorous observation and deep philosophical work, how he critically reevaluated his own pretty famous, even, fiery critiques of American democracy from earlier in his life.
Fiery is a good word for it, based on what he says himself.
Right. And he certainly doesn't back away from admitting its deep, persistent flaws that, still echo today, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But in the end, he lands on this powerful affirmation of its extraordinary achievements and its huge potential. So we're going to try and carefully piece together his changing views, looking at the practical stuff, the government mechanics he talks about, but also the deeper philosophical ideas behind his arguments. We'll trace that journey from what he himself called, youthful anger.
Yeah, spleen, I think he said.
Spleen, exactly. From that to a much more mature, kind of nuanced appreciation of the whole American experiment.
Okay, let's unpack this. What's really fascinating here, and honestly pretty rare for a big public intellectual, is how Durant goes back and critiques his own earlier work.
It really is rare.
It's like getting this special peek inside a philosopher's head as he evolves, right? Seeing that moment where someone like him basically says, you know what, that thing I wrote years ago, it was incomplete. Maybe I was just wrong back then.
Yeah, immature was his word.
It takes real intellectual guts to do that publicly.
It absolutely does. And in Fallen Leaves, Durant is incredibly upfront about it. He specifically looks back at a chapter in his 1929 book, The Mansions of Philosophy. The chapter was called, Is Democracy a Failure?
Wow, provocative title even then.
Totally. And he doesn't soften the blow looking back. He calls that chapter one-sided, unfair, and immature. Pretty strong words about his own writing.
That's really something.
Yeah, and he even says he kind of shudders thinking about rereading his current essay years from now and finding similar issues. It shows this deep, self-awareness. So this isn't just him tweaking an old idea. It's a major intellectual reckoning, a complete rethink of a big stance he took earlier.
That's incredible, isn't it? A philosopher like Durant admitting to what he called a shameful outburst of ingratitude and spleen. It just drives home that idea that even the smartest folks, the ones hunting for truth, they're always learning, always growing, always refining things.
Constantly evolving.
So, okay, let's go back to 1929. What exactly was he saying back then? What were these big criticisms that got him so worked up, this youthful spleen?
Well, his criticisms back then were incredibly direct, almost blunt, really. And what's striking is how many of them still sound familiar in today's debates about government and, public trust.
Oh, interesting.
So back in 29, Durant basically saw American democracy as broken in several key ways. First, he argued that public opinion itself was misinformed, misled, and thoughtlessly passionate.
Ouch. So not just sometimes wrong, but fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, easily manipulated, driven by emotion, not reason. That was his take. Then he claimed that powerful political machines had a death grip on nominations for office.
Okay.
And these machines, he said, always favored what he kind of sarcastically called obedient mediocrities.
Obedient mediocrities. Love that phrase.
Right. Instead of people with real qualifications or vision, he felt it just stifled actual talent.
So basically, party hacks getting picked over competent people.
That was his view. And he didn't stop there. He painted this really bleak picture of city governments, municipal officialdom, calling it flat out corrupt and incompetent.
Wow, just across the board.
Seemed like it, based on his writing.
Right.
A sweeping condemnation of local government, and it went right to the top. State legislatures, even the U.S. Congress, he saw them as subservient to lobbies and wealth.
So captured by special interests.
Exactly. Influenced by money, not representing the people. And maybe the most damning thing he said was that the leaders, the presidents, the governors, they were just too busy with electioneering to have time to think.
Too busy running for office to actually govern.
That was the charge. Too focused on the next campaign to deal with the big challenges. So these weren't small complaints, they were fundamental attacks on the whole system he was looking at.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting. He wasn't just complaining, right? He actually proposed a solution. A pretty detailed one, too. It wasn't just criticism. It was like, here's my blueprint to fix it.
Exactly. And that's very Durant, right? Not just diagnosing the problem, but offering a very specific, thought-out prescription. He proposed what he called a nicely graduated scheme to improve government, basically designed to guarantee competence in office.
A graduated scheme. How would that work?
Well, his big idea started with setting up accredited schools, schools of administration, diplomacy, government, inside universities. Think of them like serious, specialized training grounds like med school or law school, but for running the country.
Okay, professionalizing public service.
Precisely. Then, graduates from these elite schools would get the automatic right, not just the chance, the right to run for city office, municipal office.
Automatic right.
Yeah. And then the scheme kept going up the ladder. If you served 2 successful terms as mayor of a major city in a state, you'd automatically be eligible for state office.
A clear progression.
And then 2 terms as governor. That automatically made you eligible for Congress. And the top tier, 2 terms as a U.S. senator. That automatically made you eligible for president or vice president.
Whoa. So it's like a direct pipeline for trained experts, bypassing some of the usual political messiness, a real meritocracy.
That was the idea. A system where competence wasn't just hoped for, it was structurally built in. Now, he did say that, the regular party nominations would still happen, open to anyone.
Right.
But the key was, he stressed, education would no longer be a disqualification for office, which is kind of a funny way to put it.
Yeah, implying it almost was back then.
Maybe.
Yeah.
And he even thought maybe the parties themselves might eventually see the light and start nominating these trained people, seeing it as an advantage, like hiring a trained doctor.
Interesting.
But what's really wild is that later in life, when Durant is disowning almost everything else in that early article, calling it that shameful outmost,
Yeah.
he admits he still kind of loves this particular scheme.
Yeah.
He says he rejoices seeing universities actually setting up schools of government. Maybe not his exact rigid system, but the spirit of it.
So that core belief in needing trained, competent leaders stuck with him, even as his overall view of democracy changed.
It seems so. It suggests he never quite let go of that fundamental idea about competence and expertise in government, even while completely rethinking his overall verdict on the American system.
Okay, so what does this all mean then? He looks back, he cringes at his younger self's shameful outburst. But he holds on to this idea about training leaders. It can't just be that he got older and less angry, right? Something must have happened, something he saw in the U.S. after 1929 that made him completely reevaluate that harsh early critique. What changed his mind so dramatically?
You nailed it. That's the absolute turning point. It wasn't just getting older, it was what he saw happen historically. His later view, shaped by living through the mid-20th century, especially everything after 29, led him to this huge conclusion. American democracy, for all its flaws, had actually matched its defects with its achievements. That's the core of the shift.
Match defects with achievements. Okay.
Yeah. He basically watched the country, when faced with enormous challenges, show this surprising ability to grow, to adapt, to actually solve problems in ways that delivered real improvements. And that, for him, balanced out those deep flaws he'd ripped into earlier. It was like seeing the system's resilience in real time.
And he gives specific examples, right? He doesn't just say, things got better. He points to leaders he saw as having courage, integrity, and vision. People like FDR, LaGuardia in New York.
John Lindsay, Nelson Rockefeller, too.
Right. It seems like he saw a different kind of leader emerge, directly countering his old complaint about obedient mediocrities, and politicians just focus on elections.
Exactly. He saw leadership rising to the occasion. And beyond just individuals, he felt the national government itself met these incredible challenges in ways his younger self just wouldn't have believed possible.
What kind of challenges are we talking about?
Well, think about the scale. The Great Depression that could have completely torn the country apart economically and socially.
Yeah.
The growing racial crisis, this deep moral wound needing serious attention. And then 2 world wars. Monumental existential struggles that demanded incredible national effort and foresight.
Okay, those are huge.
Right. And the fact that the system could navigate and ultimately overcome these massive, complex crises showed him that, despite the flaws, it had this surprising, vital strength. It could adapt in ways he'd dismissed earlier.
And he also noticed something else, didn't he? That sometimes the government was actually ahead of what people wanted.
Yes. That's a really insightful point he makes. He observed that the government was often far ahead of public opinion when it brought in certain measures, things that might have been unpopular or controversial at first. But over time, people came to appreciate them, and they clearly helped the country. It suggests leaders weren't just following polls, but were capable of looking ahead, taking bold steps, even if it wasn't immediately popular. Leading, essentially.
That's a huge point, government leading public opinion, not just following it. Can you give some examples of those kinds of advancements, the social, the economic changes the government pushed through, even if they weren't slam dunks initially? Because it sounds like he's talking about a pretty fundamental change in the government's whole role.
Oh, absolutely. He saw a massive shift. He points to several key areas where the government really stepped in and changed things fundamentally. For instance, he highlights that the government made almost as many concessions to labor as to business.
Okay, leveling the playing field a bit more.
Exactly. Before that, big business often had most of the power. This shift meant recognizing workers' rights to organize, to bargain collectively, leading to fairer wages, better conditions, a real rebalancing act.
What else?
Well, the government also started to actively protect borrowers from usurers, cracking down on predatory lending that trapped people in debt.
Consumer protection, basically.
Yeah, and along those lines, protecting purchasers from false packaging or labeling, making sure products were what they said they were and safe. These weren't small tweaks. They were the government taking on new responsibilities towards its citizens.
Okay.
But the absolute biggest one for Durant, the real linchpin of his change of heart, was his conclusion that the government essentially saved the American economy by mitigating capitalistic rigors with the welfare state.
Save the economy with the welfare state. Wow, that's the monumental claim.
It is. For him, this wasn't just policy tinkering. It was the crucial intervention that kept the whole American system stable and viable in the long run. It stopped it from collapsing under its own weight, basically. This idea is central to his whole revised view.
That's a massive statement. Save the American economy with the welfare state.
Yeah.
Now, I know the welfare state is often controversial, still is today. And Durant knew that, right? He mentions that common conservatives worry the idea that people are naturally lazy and need the fear of hunger to make them work. That's a really old argument, isn't it? That without that threat, society just falls apart because nobody works.
It's ancient, absolutely. It goes way back. And Durant himself brings that history in. He talks about Polybius, the Greek historian from way back, like 130 BC.
Polybius, what did he say?
Well, Polybius, kind of like Plato before him, was really worried about democracy falling apart. He thought if you let it run wild, it could easily slide into mob rule, what he called a rule of force and violence. Yeah. He argued that when popular leaders, maybe trying to get famous or powerful, start creating an appetite for gifts and the habit of receiving them among the people, basically handing out free stuff,
Right.
a dangerous cycle starts. The people get used to feed at the expense of others, and Polybius warned they'd degenerate into perfect savages.
Perfect savages, strong word.
Very. And eventually they'd become so dependent and chaotic that they'd end up needing a master and monarch, a dictator, basically, to come in and impose order.
So too much freedom and handouts lead straight to tyranny. That connects to Plato, too.
Exactly. Plato worried that the excesses of democracy, everyone just doing their own thing, no sense of duty, relying on the state, would pave the way for a dictator. So Durant uses these classical guys to frame the very real, long-standing conservative fear about the welfare state potentially undermining individual responsibility and leading society downhill. He's showing these aren't just modern complaints.
Right. These fears have deep historical roots. Polybius saw a definite danger, that slippery slope. And Durant himself, even though he ended up defending the welfare state, he admitted there were real problems with it, didn't he? He saw the downsides, the abuses.
He was incredibly honest about it, which actually makes his final defense stronger, I think. He wasn't wearing rose-tinted glasses. Durant flat out admitted that thousands of people use pensions, relief checks, and unemployment benefits to finance long periods of indolence.
So people taking advantage of the system.
Yeah, he acknowledged it was happening, people choosing not to work because they could get by on public money. He also pointed out the really troubling thing where many employees live apart from their wives and children in order that these may be eligible for relief.
Wow. Gaming the system even if it broke up families.
Right, highlighting these perverse incentives, and he worriedly conceded that voluntary idleness at public expense has become a drain on municipal, state, and national treasuries, which then leads to ever-rising taxation on everyone else.
Okay, so he saw the costs, the potential for abuse.
Absolutely. These weren't easy things for him to admit, given where he landed. It shows he was really looking at the facts, warts and all.
Okay, so despite admitting all that the freeloading, the system gaming, the drain on taxes, Durant still makes this really powerful case for keeping the welfare state, even expanding it. Why? What's the core reason, he says, it's not just about being decent, but almost like an economic necessity, a survival tool for capitalism itself?
His argument is really layered. It's philosophical, but also very practical, almost, Keynesian in its economics. First, sure, he says the welfare state is a dictate of decency, basic human compassion helping the vulnerable.
Okay, the moral argument.
Right, but he goes way beyond that. He sees it much more significantly as a measure of insurance against class conflict at home.
Insurance against revolution, basically.
Pretty much. He understood that if you let economic inequality get too extreme, it breeds resentment, unrest, and could eventually blow up the whole social order. So providing a safety net helps keep the peace by easing the worst poverty and anger.
Makes sense. What else?
He also saw it as a measure of insurance against foreign competition for the suffrages of mankind. Remember the Cold War context.
Right, the battle for hearts and minds.
Exactly. Durant saw that a stable, fairer society, one that took care of its people, would be a much better advertisement for capitalism against communism or other authoritarian systems globally. It showed capitalism could have a social conscience.
Okay, so decency, social stability, global image.
No.
You said there was a core economic argument, too.
Yes, and this is probably his most crucial point. He lays out this fundamental idea. The American economy can flourish only if the power of the people to purchase goods rises step by step with their power to produce them.
Okay, purchasing power has to keep up with production.
Absolutely critical. Because, as he points out, our ability to produce stuff is always increasing, repeatedly advanced by improved technology, management, and skills. We get better and better at making things more efficiently.
Right, automation, innovation.
Exactly. But if most people, the consumers, don't have enough money, wages, purchasing power to actually buy all that stuff,
Then the whole system jams up.
precisely. You've got warehouses full of goods, but nobody can afford them. So the economy stalls. He called it the vicious spiral of capitalism without a strong safety net.
The vicious spiral. How does that work?
He argued that natural inequalities mean wealth tends to concentrate in fewer hands over time.
Okay.
This concentrated wealth then gets reinvested, mostly back into making production even more efficient, more mechanized, to boost profits further. But then you get this critical imbalance. The gap between how much we can produce and how much people can actually buy gets wider and wider.
Production outstrips consumption.
Right. Until production has to slow down to let consumption catch up. But slowing production means fewer jobs, lower wages overall, which just makes the gap between rich and poor even wider.
It feeds on itself.
Exactly. It's a feedback loop where the very engine of capitalism making and buying stuff starts to choke itself, potentially threatening the whole free enterprise system.
So, in his view, the welfare state isn't killing capitalism. It's actually like the oil needed to keep the engine running smoothly by making sure people can buy the things capitalism produces.
That's a great way to put it. Durant argues that the cheapest alternative to this whole destructive spiral, the alternative to capitalism collapsing on itself, is an ampler distribution of the wealth that's actually created by capitalism's energy and innovation.
So don't kill capitalism, just tweak it, spread the benefits around more smartly to keep it going.
Exactly. It's like intelligent self-preservation for the system. And he saw the period from roughly in 1933 to 1965 as when America actually did this, found that balance.
What specific actions did he point to?
Well, things like actively encouraging labor unions and collective bargaining, giving workers more power and a bigger slice of the pie,
Okay.
extending the graduated income tax and estate taxes, making sure those with more contribute a larger share back, redistributing resources,
Correct.
and crucially, government spending treasury payments for things like public health, social security, education for everyone, public parks and recreation, job programs, all these things, he argued, were the welfare state in action, deliberately spreading the wealth more broadly.
Got it.
And he wraps up this powerful defense by calling this whole effort, building and maintaining the welfare state, the most vital achievement of American statesmanship in our time.
The most vital achievement. That's huge.
It is. And get this. He ranks it second only to the brilliant repulse of fascist Germany and imperialistic Japan.
Whoa, putting domestic economic policy right up there with winning World War II.
That's how important he thought it was. It shows the immense significance he placed on it for America's success and survival.
That is a remarkably strong endorsement, and it certainly paints a clear picture of Durant's own political leanings, doesn't it? The sources show he pretty consistently favored the Democrats from way back in 1916.
Yeah, with just that one exception for Herbert Hoover in 28.
Right. Maybe Hoover's academic progressive image appealed before the Depression hit, but his admiration for FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, really comes through loud and clear. He had that amazing quote, something like, "The grandchildren of our tycoons will build statues to him."
That's the one. It perfectly captures that long-term view, right? The idea that actions that seemed radical or were opposed by the wealthy then would eventually be seen, generations later, as absolutely essential for saving the nation, even by the descendants of those initial opponents.
A really powerful image. Okay, so moving from that huge historical achievement, Durant then turns his attention to challenges he was seeing closer to his own time, right? Like the war against poverty.
Exactly. He pivots to that, calling it an immense and unprecedented enterprise. He recognized just how big and ambitious it was. And importantly, he says it's entitled to make mistakes.
Entitled to make mistakes. What does he mean by that?
I think it shows his realism again. He understood that tackling something as massive and complex as widespread poverty wouldn't be perfect right out of the gate. There would be problems, inefficiencies, things that didn't work.
Sure.
But he felt the effort itself, the moral drive to try and fix poverty, was so important that we shouldn't just dismiss the whole thing because of early hiccups or imperfections. The goal justified the inevitable stumbles along the way.
And he was pretty blunt about the major obstacles facing that war on poverty, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Not just money issues, but deeper stuff like the growth of ghettos in our cities and of racial animosities in our hearts.
Oh, yeah. He saw those as huge, deeply rooted problems that made lifting people out of poverty incredibly difficult, systemic issues.
Sure.
And he draws this really stark contrast with Western Europe at the time. He thought Europe was, in some ways, more fortunate in dealing with these kinds of urban and social problems.
More fortunate how?
Well, he observed that European cities often seemed better managed by officials, better trained, more professional city government, maybe less corruption. They also had, in his view, more deeply rooted traditions of social order, maybe a stronger sense of community, shared history that made big social programs easier to manage.
Interesting.
And crucially, he noted that European countries had relatively small, unassimilated ethnic minorities, which for him meant their process of integrating different groups was just far less complicated and tense than America's, with its much larger, more diverse populations.
Right. America's scale of diversity was unique.
And he was especially struck, even appalled, by what he saw happening in New York City on his visits. He saw it as a kind of symbol of America's wider urban issues.
What did he describe seeing in New York?
He painted this really vivid picture. Foreign immigration, white immigration, and the differential birth rate are conspiring to make our leading city a confusion of poor foreign people surrounding poor white enclaves amid a forest of hotel or office towers possessed by proud suburbanites who enter in the morning and flee in the afternoon.
Wow. That's a powerful image of fragmentation. Different worlds living side by side but totally separate.
Exactly. Deep social and economic divides, alienation, potential for conflict. He saw it as a really worrying trend for American cities.
And he asked some really tough, almost scary questions based on that, doesn't he? Like, are our cities basically doomed? He's asked, are our great cities doomed to raise hatreds, class war, and relief expenditures threatening municipal bankruptcy?
Tough questions.
And then, how shall we ever absorb these hostile millions into American life? I mean, those are huge, pressing questions that, frankly, still feel relevant today. So, Faced with that bleak picture, where does he find hope? What's his answer for how America can absorb and integrate everyone?
Well, typically, Durant, his answer isn't some quick fix or easy optimism. It's grounded in a kind of patient faith in the institutions he believed in most. He basically says, yes, America will absorb these diverse, sometimes struggling populations,
Okay.
but it won't be fast or easy. It will happen by passing their children and grandchildren through our schools and colleges, through our political institutions, and through the training of skills in an equal opportunity economy.
So it's a long game. Integration happens over generations through education, jobs, participating in the system.
That's his vision. It relies on those established American pathways, education, economic opportunity, civic participation, to gradually bring everyone into a shared American life.
And he's realistic about the friction in the meantime, right? He admits there will be suspicion, resentment, disorder, violence for maybe a decade or more. He doesn't pretend it'll be smooth sailing.
Not at all. He totally acknowledges the current pain and conflict, but he holds on to the belief that these will subside. It's a very pragmatic, almost stoic view of how social change works, messy and difficult now, but ultimately progressive over the long haul.
And he backs us up with history, doesn't he?
Yeah.
He points to past examples in America where similar integration happened, even against huge opposition.
Yes, and these examples are really powerful. He brings up the Know Nothing Party, those anti-immigrant movements a century before his time. He says back then, it was dangerous to be a Catholic in America. Riots, violence, intense prejudice.
Hard to imagine now in many places.
Exactly. He points out the reversal. Now, in many of our cities, it's dangerous not to be a Catholic, meaning their political and social power had become so established. That huge shift showed him America's capacity, however slow, for assimilation.
What other examples did he use?
He talks about Italian immigrants. In his youth, they were often doing the hardest labor, digging ditches. But by his time, he notes, they control the largest bank in the United States, referring to Bank of America and its founder, Giannini.
Wow, talk about upward mobility.
Right. And he highlights the incredible progress made by the American Jews in the last half century, from being, harassed and impoverished people of the Lower East Side in New York to becoming one of the most numerous, affluent, and respected elements in Los Angeles. He saw these historical paths as evidence, as a reason to hope for a similar rise of our darker-skinned brothers and sisters.
No.
Past success offered a blueprint for the future.
So the famous melting pot still melts. But Durant has a specific way of defining that, right? It's not just about everyone intermarrying or blending biologically.
Exactly. He refines that idea. He says the melting pot works not so much by mingling bloods as by raising the level of education and the standard of life. It's about shared opportunity, upward mobility through institutions, creating a common ground that way.
Okay, so upliftment through the system.
Right. Now, he's honest here, too. He admits the process has been retarded by color differences and excessive immigration. He recognizes that visible racial differences and just the sheer number of newcomers can make assimilation harder and slower.
So he sees the unique challenges.
He does, but then he immediately points to the counter evidence. The hundreds of thousands of prosperous minorities in the United States today, he's saying, look, it is happening even with the challenges. We have proof. Okay. And then he throws out this great rhetorical question really aimed at us, the listeners. How many more will there be after another half century of universal free schooling and widened access to positions that develop intelligence and responsibility?
It's a challenge based on faith in the system's potential.
Exactly. It underlines his core belief in social mobility, economic opportunity, and maybe above all, education, as the real engines driving American integration and progress forward.
Which brings us right back to education. He seems to put so much weight on it, almost like it's the last line of defense, even while admitting it has flaws. It feels like the key mechanism for him.
It absolutely is. Education is really the bedrock of his long-term hope for America. Now, he's not naive about it. He acknowledges the helpful criticisms others made of the school system. He wasn't just blindly cheering it on.
Okay.
His own view, he says, came from his own teaching experience before 1938, public school, private school, college, university. He'd seen it all. And he actually believed that, historically, European schools probably offered better training in knowledge, thinking, and discipline of character and mind.
Wait, so he thought European schools were better in some ways. Then why put so much faith in American education? That sounds kind of contradictory.
But that's the crucial distinction. That's the core of why he thinks American education is so powerful, despite maybe not always matching European rigor in every area. He explicitly says he counts not on the superiority of our schools so much as upon their number and reach.
It's about access.
Yeah.
Scale. Democracy.
Exactly. The sheer breadth of it, the fact that it aims for universality, unlike many historically stratified European systems. He saw American schools as constantly responding to criticism, checking their laxity, paring their frills, and raising the mental level and equipment of a whole people, including racial minorities.
So it's a dynamic, self-improving system with massive reach.
Yes. And he calls this whole ongoing effort a heroic enterprise. He knew it faced huge hurdles. Public apathy towards learning, deep-seated prejudice trying to block access, even taxpayer revolts against funding it properly, things he saw happening even then.
Still sounds familiar today.
Doesn't it? But despite all those persistent problems, he ends this thought with this incredibly strong, almost defiant statement of faith. When I am driven to my last stand, I place my faith in the courage of our people and our educational institutions to justify America in history.
Wow. Justify America in history. That puts education right at the center of the nation's entire meaning and legacy.
It's a profound claim. Education is the ultimate engine of progress, integration, and America's historical redemption, in a way.
That's a powerful idea. And it leads us nicely into Durant's final, big-picture assessment of the country, summing it all up. He's so clear about the faults, right? He even says he himself has too readily advertised and condemned them. Very self-aware.
He doesn't pull punches, even against himself. And he certainly doesn't try to hide America's problems at the end. He gives this whole unvarnished list of the many evils that he says still tarnish our record.
What kind of things does he include in that list?
It's pretty comprehensive. He mentions aggressive war, acknowledging times America overstepped militarily, childish chauvinism, that kind of boastful, uncritical nationalism.
Okay.
Political corruption and business chicanery show his ongoing worries about integrity in government and the economy. Racial inequities, obviously, remain a huge issue for him.
Still relevant.
Very. He also includes proliferating crime, suggesting worries about social order, and then he goes into societal things. Broken marriages, pointing to family issues, declining morals, a broad concern about ethics, and even decadent arts, suggesting a worry about cultural standards.
So it's a really wide-ranging critique covering foreign policy, politics, economics, social issues, culture, everything. He's definitely not ending with a simple rah-rah America message.
Not at all. It's an unflinching look at the persistent shortcomings.
And importantly, he doesn't seem to think humans are suddenly going to become perfect angels and fix all this, does he? He's not betting on some radical change in human nature.
That's such a key part of his mature view, total realism. Durant explicitly states he does not expect that the nature of man will change to remove the biological sources of our sins and ills.
Wow. So we're stuck with our flaws, basically.
That's his take. He accepts the enduring human condition, our mix of good and bad. He's not waiting for utopia or perfect people. In fact, he even says something fascinating, that the cries of our pessimists are justified and useful.
Useful? How can pessimism be useful?
He implies that the criticism itself, the complaining, the highlighting of flaws, it actually serves a vital purpose. It's part of how society corrects itself, how it keeps striving. It's like the discontent is the engine for improvement, a very pragmatic view.
Okay, so he accepts the flaws, accepts human nature isn't changing, but still, he balances all that negativity with this deep optimism. He says, I see the best as well as the worst, and I will not apologize for my country.
That's a really strong, defiant stance. What's the best that outweighs all those evils he just listed? The best for him comes down to a profound sense of gratitude for what the American experiment has achieved and the unique opportunities it offers. He imagines the Founding Fathers coming back and being absolutely amazed at the degree to which we have reduced poverty, drudgery, illiteracy, and governmental tyranny. He sees massive concrete improvements in the actual lives of ordinary people compared to their time. Lessening those basic burdens of life was, for him, a monumental success.
So tangible progress and well-being.
Huge progress. And then he makes this really stunning claim that a large part of the utopias described by Thomas More, Samuel Butler, Edward Bellamy, and H.G. Wells has been materially realized.
Wait, realized utopias, like actual elements of humanity's dream societies made real.
That's what he's saying. Not perfectly, of course, but significant parts of those idealistic visions, things people only dreamed about for centuries, had become practical realities in America. It's an extraordinary claim about the country's success.
It really is, that America actually built parts of utopia.
And he connects it directly back to the Enlightenment thinkers of the 18th century. Their radical dreams, things like universal education, adult suffrage, freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. ideas that were revolutionary and often suppressed back then.
Hmm.
He says these have been largely achieved and baked into the American system. It's like a living victory for those core Enlightenment values of reason and liberty.
Oh.
And then, maybe the most moving part, it gets very personal. Durant expresses this deep, heartfelt gratitude for the freedom of mind that I have enjoyed in America. He truly believed he couldn't have found that same open road for thinking, writing, exploring ideas anywhere else in the world he'd studied.
That's powerful, coming from someone who studied so many civilizations, finding his intellectual home here.
Exactly. It's a profound personal testimony anchoring all the big historical observations.
And it leads to that fascinating conclusion, the idea that even our complaining, our dissatisfaction, our rebellion,
Yeah.
it's actually part of our strength, not a weakness.
It is paradoxical, isn't it? He sums it up with that amazing final call to action, which is also an affirmation. Let us continue to complain, to demand, and to rebel. This, too, is part of our virtue.
Wow. So the struggle's the virtue.
Durant, yes. That constant striving, the criticism, the pushing for better, that is American vitality. It's not about reaching some perfect endpoint, but about the messy, ongoing journey. The complaints are proof of life, proof of engagement, proof that people care enough to demand more.
And he ends it all on such a personal, almost humble note of thanks, doesn't he? Not just analyzing the country, but feeling it. Favored and fortunate. I should be the worst ingrate if I did not thank the fates that deposited me here between these seas and within these liberties. Just beautiful.
It really is.
Yeah.
It brings this whole sweeping philosophical view right down to one person's genuine gratitude. A perfect ending, really.
So we've really journeyed through Will Durant's quite remarkable evolution on America, from those sharp youthful critiques he later called immature to this much more, well, nuanced and deeply felt appreciation of its achievements. We saw him champion the welfare state, not just as charity, but as a crucial stabilizer. We looked at his worries about cities and race, but also his profound faith in education and that refined melting pot idea, lifting people up through opportunity.
Yeah, we saw America through his lens. A nation deeply riddled with flaws, war, corruption, inequality, all of it, but also capable of profound greatness, achieving things past generations only dreamed of. His core belief seems clear, that talent and ability just have more room to grow here than almost anywhere else, and that American liberty, especially that freedom of mind he valued so much, is an incredible gift.
Absolutely. This deep dive into Durant's Fallen Leaves definitely gives us a lot to chew on. It's such a great reminder that you can be fiercely critical. You can see all the problems, all the human failings, and still find real hope and deep gratitude. It's not about ignoring the bad, but seeing the good, the progress, the potential despite it.
And that really leaves us with a question for you, the listener, doesn't it? A question Durant himself wrestled with. He saw our mistakes and our progress, our worst and our best. Thinking about the challenges he saw and the ones we face now, what enduring virtues do you think will carry America forward? And maybe more personally, what's your role in keeping this complicated, messy, but vital experiment going?
A great question to ponder. Thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into Will Durant's thoughts on American democracy. We hope it gave you something to think about. Until next time.